Thank you. We'll start on the second session on air politics, the last session of the day. It's been a fantastic day. And we'll start with Hannah Swee, who has a PhD in social anthropology from UCL. And her research focuses on how people live with recurring disaster threats and disaster risk reduction, capacity building, climate change, and so on. And she's going to talk about the role of cyclone forecasting in responding to uncertainty. So get started.
Okay, so I want to take you to a slightly different region in the world now, to Australia, to a region called Far North Queensland, where I conducted 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork. And the overall focus of my research here was to investigate how people live with an annual season of cyclones. And what I want to do today is present a range of ethnographic insights or a series of ethnographic cases from my fieldwork that relate to the topic of cyclone forecasting. And my aim here is to not only describe what these methods of forecasting are and how they're used, but also to explore how these modes of forecasting also play a crucial role as responses to the uncertainty that comes with living with frequent cyclone threats. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of extra background information on this region, as you can see on this map, it's located in the northeast of Australia, just under Papua New Guinea. It actually covers a really massive area, which is around 270,000 square kilometres. However, my research was really focused on the biggest town in this region called Cairns and the smaller coastal dwelling towns that surround it. As a region, Far North Queensland is largely agricultural, but since the Great Barrier Reef lies just off its coast, millions of tourists pass through this region every year. And its own population is highly multicultural with significant numbers of Indigenous groups. And throughout this presentation, I'll be referring to my research informants as locals. They are long-term residents in this region, and this is the term that they would use to describe themselves. Now, what makes Far North Queensland interesting in this study of hazards and disasters is its cyclone season. Its climate is typically tropical, so it's warm all year, and there's a wet and a dry season. The cyclone season coincides with the wet season, which happens from around November to April. In this time, on average, 4 cyclones develop in the Coral Sea, and that's over here. And while not all of these cyclones end up making landfall in the region, some of them do. Cyclones come in different strengths, from Category 1, which is often described as a big storm, to a Category 5, which can be extremely destructive. So actually both Category 4 and 5 cyclones are considered severe and extremely destructive. And in the past 10 years, 4 of these severe cyclones have made landfall in the region, and they have all caused significant damage. So to start my discussion on cyclone forecasting, what I want to do is to firstly introduce you to the people in my study and give you a glimpse into their relationships with the weather and how they form ideas of what normal weather means at different times in the year. One morning in March, while I was in the midst of my fieldwork, I had woken to find that my face was covered in what appeared to be hundreds of itchy red bumps, an aggressive heat rash brought on by the sweltering heat of the night that had just passed. At the time, I was staying with Peg, a local in her 60s, and as I walked out to the kitchen for breakfast, she took one look at my face and exclaimed, "Sweetheart, go out there in the rain and cover your face in that goodness." Although I was a little skeptical, I decided to follow Peg's advice and quickly dashed out into the garden. The rain was pelting down, and I was drenched within seconds. When I was back inside the house, Peg gave me strict instructions not to touch my face in order to allow the rain to dry naturally and be absorbed into my skin. This, she explained, was pivotal to allow my skin to fully obtain the healing benefits of the rain. Although she couldn't explain why or how, rain for her had the ability to heal, since it always seemed to help relieve her skin issues. Peg's faith in the healing powers of the rain was just one of many ways in which she, like many others in Far North Queensland, expressed and enacted their close relationship with the weather. Active engagements with the weather were seamlessly woven into daily practices. For example, I was struck by how common it was to keep a domestic rain gauge in the garden to track patterns of rainfall. For Peg, checking her rain gauge was a daily activity, carried out after breakfast, and she explained that tracking rainfall patterns was an activity that she enjoyed doing for her own amusement. Some mornings, after a night of heavy rain, Peg's practice of going out to the back garden to check her rain gauge was approached with a degree of excitement and curiosity. During these mornings, as we ate breakfast together, Peg would explain to me that it felt like a lot of rain had fallen. She would give me her predictions on the amount and explicitly express her eagerness to find out whether her predictions were correct. Her predictions always turned out to be approximately accurate, or close enough for Peg to feel reassured of her prediction skills. Even though these observations were never written down by Peg, they did serve a purpose that went beyond her own amusement. As the morning passed, Peg would either make her way to one of the multitude of community groups that she was involved in, or to morning tea meetings with friends. And if she wasn't going out, she would spend many more hours tending to her garden. It was while she was engaged in these activities that Peg would also engage in conversations with friends, neighbours, or passers-by, whom she usually greeted when she was out in the front garden of her home. These conversations would inevitably include discussions where she would recount her findings from earlier in the day, evaluating them against other people's findings, although the discussion could ensue even if the other person didn't have a rain gauge, since everyone had an opinion about the weather. It was here within these conversations about the weather that locals such as Peg discussed climatic trends, and the seemingly mundane morning observations from a rain gauge in the garden were endued with greater meanings. Within these daily conversations, a sense of what is considered to be normal weather and what is expected to occur at certain times in the year is established and debated. Rainfall, then, constitutes a specific pattern of weather that is forecasted, expected, and occurs with a dependable regularity. So my discussion so far has focused on forecasting rainfall patterns, but throughout my fieldwork, I also found that it was extremely common for locals to use signs in the environment to predict and forecast when a cyclone would occur. Christine, for example, one of my close informants, often shared with me how she forecasted cyclones. She was an artist in her 40s and had spent her entire life in far north Queensland. One afternoon in January, on one of my many visits to Christine's home, I helped her to move a small plastic table and a few chairs from her kitchen to the driveway so that we could sit outside. We had got together to weave, and since it was a bright sunny day with no signs of rain, we decided to make the most of it and sit outdoors. The clear day was a welcome relief after what felt like a week of never-ending monsoon rain. As I mentioned this to Christine, she replied that she didn't think we would get many more clear days like this that week, since she felt that a cyclone would be approaching soon. Curious about her prediction, I asked her how she knew this, since I had not heard any cyclone alerts in the past few days. She replied, "Hannah, look up there, see the clouds? See the way they're arranged in that way? When it's like that, you know a cyclone's brewing." I looked up at the sky, scanning the clouds, trying to find a pattern. My confusion must have been obvious, and she added, "When something big is brewing, it disrupts the clouds. They come out as ripples like you see up there. A long time ago, my aunties told me that all of us Murrays use the clouds to predict cyclones just like this." And the photo you can see behind me is from this day. So Christine's use of the term Murray here refers to her identity as a Jabugai Aboriginal woman, and the Jabugai are one of the original inhabitants of the far north Queensland coast. But while Christine's observations about the clouds were based on stories passed down to her from her ancestors, such observations were certainly not limited to those with Aboriginal heritage. The day after my conversation with Christine, I met with a group of 3 other local women, all of whom were not Aboriginal, but were born and bred in far north Queensland. We were sitting outside a cafe just before noon, and staring out at the sky, they too exclaimed that it looked as if a storm were coming. Of course, this caught my attention due to the conversation that I had just the day before. and I asked the women how they knew this. Pointing to the clouds, they explained that when the clouds appeared low in the sky in relation to the surrounding mountains, it was a sign that a storm was brewing. Several days later, I went to visit Linda, a lawyer who had moved to Cairns from New Zealand around 10 years prior. As we too attempted to sit outdoors, we noticed that her veranda was swamped with hundreds of green ants huddled so closely together that they appeared to be hugging each other. Linda explained that she had seen this phenomenon of ants hugging before and had noticed that a storm or cyclone usually followed. Even though there was no obvious increase in wind or rain that would suggest a storm or cyclone was about to occur, the ants could somehow predict that it was going to happen. For Linda, this highlighted the importance of nature and that nature knows how to protect itself. Clouds and ants, as these three cases show, are both extremely popular indicators of cyclones, and these signs in the environment were often referred to as a very practical way to predict and forecast cyclones. Now, this pragmatism can be better understood in light of the way in which cyclones were forecasted prior to modern alert and warning systems. Those who had lived in far north Queensland since the 1960s or earlier recall that there were so few warning systems at the time that these were mainly announcements on the radio, and that they just had to rely on the environment to indicate to them whether a storm or cyclone was coming. They didn't distinguish between a storm and a cyclone, and they would simply prepare for destructive weather as a direct response to what was happening in the environment. As one informant stated to me, growing up in Cairns, there was no way of warning when a cyclone was about to come. When the weather started acting up, then you just did what you had to do to bunker down. And as Christine reminded me, her ancestors had survived cyclones for thousands of years before because they relied on nature to forecast what would happen. So clearly, using observations in the environment is an important method of forecasting, but it also brought up tensions, particularly with the geoscientists in the region, who often referred to these methods of forecasting as bizarre. We can see this perhaps most prominently when we look at the way that locals forecasted the locations where cyclones would make landfall. As I mentioned before, Far North Queensland as a region has experienced 4 severe cyclones in the past 10 years, but Cairns on each of the 4 occasions has missed a direct landfall, at times only just. These near misses have contributed to an attitude shared by many locals that Cairns is protected from large cyclones. The first time I heard someone mention this was in the first few weeks of my fieldwork. I'd taken a short weekend trip up to the Kuranda Ranges, a popular tourist attraction which is around a 30-minute drive from Cairns, where I joined a small tour group for a walk through the rainforest. Soon after we had begun our walk, we reached what could only be described as an enormous tree. At this point, the tour guide leading my group stopped us and proudly exclaimed that this tree was a survivor. Then he proceeded to tell us that several big trees have fallen over the years due to cyclones Larry and Yazi, which were both Category 4 on impact. He explained that the ranges that we were walking through served the purpose of a natural defence against cyclones that deflected them away from Cairns. I was intrigued by his comments, as I wondered to myself how a cyclone such as Yazi, that was around 500 kilometres in diameter, could rebound off the ranges. As the months passed, however, I soon lost count of the number of times I was told that the mountain ranges that lie behind Cairns had the power to deflect cyclones, or that cyclones would rebound off the mountains and be redirected away. These ideas were always told to me as people tried to explain why cyclones seemed to come towards Cairns, but in the final hours before landfall, would rebound off the mountain ranges and be redirected slightly south. These ideas, or theories, as they were often called, also extended to the Great Barrier Reef, as locals would tell me how Cairns is naturally designed to withstand cyclones, since the mountains will protect us, or the reef will protect us. The geoscientists that I knew, however, were candid that these theories, which they termed myths, had no scientific truth to them, and one even told me that he had plans to write a short guide specifically to debunk the myths. Their studies show that it is only by pure luck that Cairns has not been directly hit by a severe cyclone in the past 50 years. To them, it seemed as if people just didn't want to accept that they too were susceptible to potentially destructive cyclones. However, for the locals that I knew, it never seemed to matter whether these theories were right or wrong or had any scientific truth to them, and proving or disproving these theories were never factored into their belief in them. In fact, despite believing in these theories, people would still prepare and were cautious about every cyclone anyway. So, on the one hand, they would tell me that they believed that cyclones would rebound off the mountains protecting Cairns, and they would refer to these theories whenever a cyclone alert was announced to explain why they anticipated the cyclone wouldn't make landfall on Cairns. Yet at the same time, they would also make sure that they prepared their homes with each threat, and they would follow the different meteorological tracking maps and the alerts issued by the authorities. So what I want to suggest is that looking at the actual purpose of these theories and forecasting methods allows us to gain a better insight into these conflicting responses. Through my fieldwork, it became clear that forecasting was a practice of reading the weather, which could produce a sense of confidence in the natural environment. The way that people forecasted using signs in the environment was a way in which they enacted a degree of faith in it and established a sense of certainty and control amidst the unpredictability of cyclones. They create a representation of reality, offering a sense of protection against the unpredictability of cyclones, and it is impossible to predict in advance the exact landfall location. Indeed, when I asked Seb, a close informant who was one of the few locals I knew who didn't believe in these theories, and when I asked him why he thought these theories had become so popular, he replied, "It's the fear of the unknown, of something they can't control. It's the uncertainty of not knowing where the big catastrophic ones are going to hit." So what I want to leave you with is two concluding points. Firstly, a proposal that any form of weather forecasting, whether from observations in the natural environment or computer-generated models from a meteorological agency, involves predictions of the future which are responses to uncertainty. And secondly, perhaps a more practical thought. In my current position working with a humanitarian agency, we're trying to formulate a new set of guidelines for resilience and disaster risk reduction, particularly in relation to floods and monsoon-related events. And part of these guidelines encourage more data collection and more research, both qualitative and quantitative. But the issue that we're now facing is how can we use this research and data as ways to baseline and measure resilience? So I'll leave you with that thought.